Hello, my friends. Before we begin, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. I never believed in haunted places or ghost stories. I like to think I was practical, rational, grounded in the real world. That all changed during the winter I spent alone in the mountains of Vermont, a winter that still haunts me every time I feel the cold wind against my face. I had been offered a short-term job taking care of a remote hunting lodge, mostly empty except for maintenance and seasonal guests. The pay was good, the isolation appealing, and I told myself it would be a chance to recharge away from the city. I didn't think twice about the warnings the locals gave. Winter comes early up there, they said, and sometimes it never really leaves. I smiled, nodded, and told myself they were just exaggerating. The lodge was a 2-story wooden structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forests. The first night, the snow fell heavily. By morning, the world outside was transformed into a white expanse. I unpacked my few belongings and prepared for a week of solitude. The fireplace in the main room worked perfectly, and I was confident I could survive the cold as long as I kept the wood stacked. The first few days were peaceful. I went on walks, surveyed the forest, and made sure the lodge was in order. But there was a feeling I couldn't shake, the kind of sensation that makes your skin crawl without any obvious cause. I attributed it to being alone, to the wind moaning through the trees, to the way shadows stretched unnaturally over the snow. But something didn't feel right. It started on the third night. I woke to a soft tapping sound at the front door. At first I thought it was the wind or a branch brushing against the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound came again. 3 deliberate taps, spaced evenly. I approached the door cautiously, peered through the small window. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed. I tried to ignore it, convinced I was imagining things. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the presence of someone or something watching. The next morning, the snow outside was unusual. There were tracks leading from the forest to the lodge, but they weren't human. They were tall, wide, and oddly symmetrical, like nothing I had seen before. They disappeared abruptly a few feet from the cabin, as if whoever or whatever was walking had vanished into thin air. I told myself it was probably some kind of animal, a deer, or maybe a large dog. But the tracks didn't match anything I recognized, and the feeling of being watched didn't let up. By the 5th day, the wind had picked up, and the temperature dropped drastically. I stayed inside, stacking wood and trying to keep the lodge warm. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, I noticed something odd on the window. Handprints. Clear, defined handprints pressed against the glass. I knew I hadn't touched the windows. They were all locked from the inside. I stepped back, heart racing. There was no way anyone could have reached the windows without leaving footprints in the snow. And yet, the prints were there, smeared as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass and tried to see inside. I couldn't explain it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a visitor had arrived while I was out. But the snow was untouched, save for the tracks I had seen earlier. There was no path to the window, no footprints, nothing. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was walking through the forest, snow up to my knees. The trees loomed over me, their branches heavy with ice. I felt eyes on me, countless eyes, watching from the shadows. I tried to run, but my legs were heavy, as if the snow itself was holding me down. I looked down and saw footprints in the snow, not my own, but taller, darker, moving in the opposite direction. They followed me everywhere I went. I woke up in a sweat, convinced the dream had been a warning. But as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The soft tapping, this time at the window of my bedroom. I didn't move. The taps continued for several minutes, rhythmic and deliberate. Then they stopped. The next day, I found the snow around the lodge disturbed again. The strange tracks circled the building, stopping at the front door, then continuing into the forest. It was as if someone had been walking around the lodge for hours, invisible, leaving no evidence except the tracks. By the end of the week, I was on edge. I began noticing small things. Objects slightly moved, footprints inside the lodge I couldn't explain, the feeling of breath on my neck when no one was there. I stopped sleeping properly, fearing what I would find if I closed my eyes. On the 8th night, the storm hit. Snow blew in thick sheets and the wind howled like it had a life of its own. I tried to stay calm, but the temperature inside the lodge dropped despite the fire. I heard the tapping again at the front door, then at the back, then along the sides. It moved around the building as if circling me, studying me. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to confront whatever was there. The snow was deep, the wind cutting through my coat. I shone the light across the clearing and the forest beyond. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, hunched over, watching me. Then it vanished. I ran back inside, locking all doors and windows. I stayed awake all night, holding the flashlight, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, the snowstorm had passed. I stepped outside, trying to see any evidence of what had been there. But the clearing was pristine, untouched, except for the strange tracks leading from the forest to the lodge. They stopped again at the edge of the snow. I packed my bags immediately. I couldn't wait to leave. I drove the winding mountain roads back to the main highway, checking the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see that figure following me. I told myself it was over. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a combination of isolation, cold, and stress. But it wasn't over. Weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph of the lodge. The picture was taken at night. I could see the windows, faintly lit by the fire inside. And outside, standing in the snow, was a figure, tall, thin, featureless, watching the building. I didn't recognize it at first until I noticed its posture. It was hunched, like it was studying something, studying me. The bottom of the photograph had a single line written in crude black ink. "You left, but I stayed." I called the authorities, thinking it was a prank, but the postmark indicated it came from the town near the lodge. The officer I spoke to gave me a blank stare and said, "You're not the first person to get something like that from that area." He refused to elaborate. I never went back to the lodge. I never took another winter job in isolation. But I still think about it, especially when I see snow falling heavily and the wind carries that unnatural chill. I think about the tracks, the handprints, the figure that disappeared into the forest, but somehow never left. I've moved to a warmer state now. I try to forget. But every winter, when the nights grow long and the cold seeps in, I feel it. Watching, waiting. Just beyond the tree line, where the snow glistens like glass. And I know, without a doubt, that it's still out there. Because some things that dwell in the winter don't leave when the snow melts. They don't go away when you drive far enough from the mountains. They wait, they watch, and when the time is right, they come for you. I never thought a house could watch you. Not figuratively, literally watch you. But after what happened in 2022, I don't doubt it for a second anymore. When I first moved into the house in Vermont, I thought I had finally found peace. A quiet neighborhood, a long driveway lined with maple trees, and a 2-story home with a porch that looked perfect for summer nights. I had no idea those trees had grown over soil, hiding things I should never have disturbed. The house had been vacant for 3 years before I bought it. The listing agent told me the previous owner had passed away, and his children wanted to sell quickly. The price was unbelievably low, but real estate had gotten weird after the pandemic, so I didn't question it. Maybe I should have. The first time I stepped through the front door, I felt something like a drop in temperature or pressure shifting in the air. It hit only for a second, almost like the house was taking a breath after being closed up too long. I brushed it off as my imagination and kept moving. I spent the first night sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor, eating pizza from a box, my belongings still in the moving truck. The house was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but heavy quiet, like every sound was being swallowed. Whenever I tried to listen closely, it felt like the silence was listening back. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping above me. I assumed it was branches brushing the roof, but when I looked outside, the trees were still. No wind at all. The tapping continued in slow, irregular beats, and when I looked up, I realized it wasn't coming from above, it was coming from the attic. I told myself old houses make noises, but the tapping wasn't random. It was deliberate. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 taps, repeating, like a pattern, almost like a message. Still, I tried to sleep. The next day, I decided to check the attic. The entrance was a square cutout in the hallway ceiling with a pull-down ladder. I grabbed the cord, pulled, and the ladder came down stiffly. A rush of cold air drifted over me. The attic smelled like dust and old insulation. My phone flashlight barely cut through the darkness. I expected to see boxes or holiday decorations left behind, but the attic was completely empty, except for one thing. Someone had drawn an eye on the far wall. Not a cartoonish one, a hyper-detailed, realistic eye that took up nearly 3 feet of space. The iris was shaded meticulously, the eyelid wrinkled. The pupil was an unnervingly deep, dark circle, and the eye was positioned perfectly so that when you climbed the ladder and looked straight ahead, it stared at you. It looked fresh, like it had been drawn recently. My stomach twisted. I climbed down and closed the attic, trying to convince myself it was just some weird art project the previous owner left behind. But the eye stayed in the back of my mind all day, following me as I unpacked boxes and organized rooms. That night, the tapping returned. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, exactly the same as before. I put headphones on and tried to sleep, but around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, heart racing. I wasn't sure why. The house was silent. Too silent. I sat up, listening. Then a soft creak came from the hallway. Then another. Someone, or something, was walking past my bedroom door. The footsteps weren't heavy like an intruder's. They were slow, barefoot, almost dragging. I held my breath, gripping my phone, ready to call the police. But the footsteps didn't continue down the hall. They stopped right outside my door. The floorboard sank slightly, the way it does when someone is standing still, waiting. I stared at the door for so long my eyes watered. After several minutes, the pressure on the floor eased, and the house went quiet again. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the hallway. Nothing was disturbed. No footprints on the dusty floorboards. No sign anyone had been there. But the attic cord was swinging slightly, as if someone had just pulled it down and pushed it back up. I didn't go to the attic again. Over the next few days, the house started feeling different. I began noticing subtle changes. Doors slightly open when I knew I'd closed them, kitchen drawers misaligned, the bathroom mirror fogged as if someone had showered. One morning, I found muddy footprints in the kitchen. Small footprints, barefoot, too small to be an adult's. My throat tightened. The dirt trailed from the back door, but the door was locked, the deadbolt still in place. No signs of forced entry. That night, the tapping came again, but this time it wasn't from the attic. It was inside the walls, 5 feet from where I sat in the living room. I pressed my ear against the drywall, heart pounding. The tapping followed me. When I shifted right, it shifted right. When I stepped back, it grew fainter, like it was retreating deeper inside the wall. And then a whisper came through the drywall so soft I barely caught it. Here. I stumbled away so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The whisper wasn't angry or threatening. It was pleading, like someone begging to be noticed. I left the house that night and slept in my car in a grocery store parking lot. The next morning, I seriously considered breaking my lease, losing my deposit, and leaving forever. But something gnawed at me. Curiosity, maybe. Stupidity, definitely. I wanted to understand what was in that house. That afternoon, I visited the town records office. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with silver glasses, found the home's file. Built in 1971, she said, owned by the Hartsfields for 3 decades. I recognized the name. They were the family who had lived there before the most recent owner. I asked if anything unusual had happened to them. The clerk hesitated. "I'm not supposed to share details," she said. "But you're not the first person to ask about that property." I leaned closer. "What happened?" She lowered her voice. "The Hartsfields had a daughter. She went missing in 1987. They searched for weeks before authorities concluded she must have run off. The case went cold." I felt goosebumps crawl up my arms. "What was her name?" I asked. "Lila," she said, 13 years old. 13. The size of the footprints in my kitchen. I drove home slowly, dread building with every mile. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller somehow, like it was sinking into itself. The windows reflected the gray sky in a way that made them look like hollow eyes. When I stepped inside, the air felt dense and cold again, just like the first day. I walked through each room carefully. Everything seemed normal until I reached the living room. The wall where I had heard the whisper had changed. Someone had carved another eye into it, smaller than the one in the attic, but identical in style, perfectly identical. Same angle, same shading, same dark pupil. The house wasn't just watching me. It wanted me to watch back. My hands shook as I backed away. I thought about getting in my car and driving until I ran out of gas. But something in me, some awful, intoxicating urge, made me walk toward the attic ladder again. When I pulled the cord, dust rained down. The ladder unfolded, creaking like old bones. I climbed. The attic was still empty, but the giant eye on the wall had changed. The iris was brighter, wet-looking, fresh, as if drawn moments before. When I stepped closer, I noticed something else. Beneath the eye, carved faintly into the wood, was a phrase I hadn't seen before. "Let me out." The words were carved over and over again, each time shakier than the last, like someone had been scratching desperately until their hands gave out. I rushed back down, shutting the attic ladder so hard it nearly snapped. I don't know what I expected. Maybe the house to grow quiet, maybe everything to stop. But the opposite happened. That night, the footsteps were louder. They paced the hallway for hours, slow, dragging, unsteady, like someone who had forgotten how to walk properly. At 3:12 a.m., my bedroom doorknob turned. I sat up, adrenaline flooding my veins, but the door didn't open. The knob twisted right, then left, then right again. Slow, experimental. Learning. When it finally stopped, a soft knock followed. One single knock, then a whisper from the other side of the door. "Please, see me." I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. The whisper came again, closer to the floor, like the speaker had crouched down. "Please, please." I didn't sleep. In the morning, I decided I was leaving. I threw clothes into bags, grabbed important documents, and stuffed whatever I could into my trunk. As I passed the hallway, I noticed the wall where the small eye had been carved. It wasn't just one eye now. There were dozens, all staring at me. I ran out the door and didn't look back. I rented an apartment 40 minutes away and tried to rebuild my life, but the nightmares didn't stop. I dreamed of the attic, the eyes, the footsteps, the tapping. A month later, I received a call from the realtor. She wanted to know if I still had the keys. "The new buyer's ready to move in," she said. I froze. "Someone bought the house?" I asked. "Oh yes, a family with a young daughter." A wave of nausea rolled through me. That night I dreamed of the missing girl, dreamed of her in the walls, tapping, whispering, dreamed of her in the attic, drawing the same eye over and over until her fingers bled. And when I woke up, heart pounding, I heard a soft tapping on the wall next to my bed. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, just like before, just like home. I moved apartments again a week later, but it didn't matter. The tapping followed. Sometimes it comes from the ceiling. sometimes from the closet, sometimes from right behind where I'm sitting, like a small hand pressing against the wallpaper. And every now and then, when the tapping stops, a whisper slips through. Here. I don't know how to make it stop. I don't know if it ever will. But I've learned something important. When a house watches you, it isn't because it wants to harm you. It's because something inside it wants you to see it. And once you do, it never lets you go. I don't tell this story often. Even when I try, people tilt their heads and give me that look. The look people use when they're trying to decide if you're unstable or just messing with them. But I swear to you, everything I'm about to say happened. And to this day, I still can't understand it. The year was 2019. I'd just moved to Flagstaff, Arizona for work. New job, new apartment, new everything. I didn't know anyone there yet, and the idea of flying home to Ohio for Christmas felt overwhelming. Between the holiday rush, the cost of flights, and the fact that I'd only been at my job for 3 months, it just made more sense to stay put. My parents understood, even though I could hear the disappointment in my mom's voice. She mailed me a Christmas package a week before the holiday. Sweaters, homemade peanut brittle, and a card telling me she missed me. I didn't know at the time that another package was already on the way. One that didn't come from my family. One that didn't have a return address. One that would ruin Christmas for me forever. Everything started on December 22nd. I came home from work to find a small box sitting on the mat outside my apartment door. Plain brown cardboard, no stamps, no shipping label, no handwriting, just my name printed in simple block letters. I assumed a neighbor had dropped it off on behalf of the office or something. People order a lot during the holidays. Boxes get mixed up. I picked it up and carried it inside. The box was surprisingly cold, colder than the winter air outside. I held it for a moment, feeling the chill seep into my palms, wondering how long it had been sitting out there. Then I opened it. Inside, wrapped in thin white tissue paper, was an old-fashioned Christmas ornament. It was glass, slightly yellowed, with an image painted on the front. A small, Victorian-style family standing under mistletoe. I recognized the style immediately. My grandmother used to collect ornaments just like this before she passed. There was no note, no card, no explanation, just the ornament. I laughed it off at first. Maybe my parents sent it separately and didn't mention it in the card. Or maybe a relative found it in an old box and thought it would be sentimental. I set it on my counter and didn't think much more about it. But during the night, something woke me up. I sleep with my door cracked open, and around 2:40 a.m., I heard a faint tapping sound, like something lightly hitting the wall. Not aggressive or loud, just persistent. Tap, tap, tap. I turned on the lamp, rubbed my eyes, and listened again. The sound seemed to come from the living room. I walked out slowly, expecting to find the blinds blowing or a loose panel tapping against the window. But the apartment was still. Quiet. Warm from the heater. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. The ornament. Instead of sitting on the counter, it was now hanging in the middle of my Christmas tree. I froze in place. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't even unwrapped my tree lights yet. There was no reason for it to be there. I walked closer, staring at the ornament as it dangled gently. I didn't feel scared yet, just unsettled, the way you feel when something small doesn't add up. I carefully removed it from the branch and placed it back on the counter where I originally set it. It rolled slightly, like the round bottom didn't sit flat. I nudged it back into place and went to bed. The tapping stopped. The apartment fell silent again. The next morning, I told myself the whole thing had a rational explanation. Maybe I had moved the ornament and forgotten. Maybe the tapping was from the heater. Maybe stress was making me jumpy. I went to work, ate lunch, came home, normal day. But the moment I stepped into the apartment, I felt a shift, like walking into a room where someone else had just been. There was a smell too, faint, sweet, almost like cinnamon and dust mixed together. I walked farther inside. and my stomach dropped. The ornament was hanging in the tree again. This time, it was swinging lightly, as if it had just been placed there moments before I walked in. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it. The painted Victorian family seemed different somehow, but I couldn't figure out how. Maybe I hadn't looked closely the night before. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a stupid ornament. I wasn't going to let holiday stress get to me, but I couldn't shake the eerie heaviness following me around. That night, the tapping returned. Faster, more urgent. Tap, 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 tap. I sat up instantly. My heart hammered in my chest. The sound wasn't coming from the living room this time. It was coming from the hallway. I got out of bed and turned on every light I passed. The tapping stopped abruptly the moment I stepped into the hall, replaced by something far worse. A faint creaking sound. Slow, rhythmic. Like someone rocking back and forth on old floorboards. But my apartment didn't have creaky wood floors. Everything was carpeted. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded. I was too shaken to sleep, so I sat on the couch until sunrise. Christmas Eve morning, I decided to take the ornament to the dumpster behind the building. I didn't care where it came from. I just wanted it gone. When I reached the dumpster, I chucked it inside without looking back. I felt stupid for even being scared of it, but I also felt relieved, like a weight had lifted. That feeling lasted exactly 3 hours. I returned home after grabbing breakfast, and there, sitting on the kitchen counter in the exact same spot as the first night, was the ornament. Same yellowed glass, same Victorian family, same tissue paper folded underneath it. I didn't breathe for a moment. I didn't move. Finally, I reached for the ornament and picked it up carefully. The glass felt colder than before, almost icy. I stared at the painted figures. This time, I noticed the difference. The father in the painting was no longer smiling. Instead, his eyes were looking upward, toward the left side of the ornament's curve. His painted facial expression had changed. I blinked hard, thinking I was imagining it. But no, it was clearly different. And now that I looked closely, the mother's face had shifted too. Her eyes were wider, her mouth slightly open. They looked frightened. That was the moment I decided I was done pretending everything was fine. I grabbed my phone, took a photo of the ornament, and sent it to my mom with a text asking if she or anyone else had mailed me something like this. She wrote back immediately, "No, honey, we didn't send that. Whose handwriting is that on the box?" What handwriting? I hadn't noticed any. I picked up the cardboard box and looked again. For the first time, I saw it. At the bottom corner of the box, faintly written in pencil, was a name. E. Cross. I didn't know anyone by that name. I searched my phone, my email, my contacts, nothing. I Googled the name, a few random results, nobody relevant. I set everything down and tried to think. None of it made sense. And the more I stared at the box, the more uneasy I felt. My apartment no longer felt like a home. It felt like something was pressing in around me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. That night, Christmas Eve, the tapping returned, louder than ever. It shook the pictures on the wall, it rattled the mugs in the cupboards, it came from everywhere at once, like hands drumming from inside the walls. I covered my ears, but the sound vibrated through me. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Dead silence. For maybe 5 seconds. And then I heard a new sound. A whisper, soft, close, right behind me. Look, I turned slowly. The ornament wasn't in the tree or on the counter. It was in the middle of my living room floor, and it was cracked. A thin fissure ran through the painted image. Inside the crack, something dark glistened, like thick ink or sap. I crouched down, unable to breathe, and the painting had changed again. This time, the Victorian family wasn't just frightened, they were staring outward, as if staring at me. Behind them in the painting was a dark figure, tall, shadow-like, featureless. Something small dripped from the crack and touched my fingertip. It was warm. Warm. That was the moment I broke. I grabbed my code keys, wallet, and bolted out of the apartment. I slept in my car that night in the parking lot of a Walmart, my eyes burning from exhaustion and fear. On Christmas morning, I returned to the apartment. I needed clothes at the very least. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door. The ornament was gone. The floor was clean. The counter was empty. The tree sat untouched. I checked every room, heart pounding, expecting to find it somewhere. But it had vanished completely. For the first time in days, I let myself believe it was over. Maybe I'd imagined more than I realized. Maybe lack of sleep had twisted things together. Everything looked normal, until I opened my fridge. And there, sitting right in the center of the top shelf, was the ornament. Not cracked, not dripping, perfectly intact. Except now, inside the glass sphere where the hook attached, something new had been pressed against the inner surface. A tiny fingerprint. My fingerprint. I dropped the ornament instantly. It shattered on the kitchen floor. Inside the broken pieces, something fluttered. A small, rectangular scrap of old photograph, curled at the edges like it had been torn from something larger. The photograph showed the door of my apartment building, and in front of it, standing perfectly still, was a man in Victorian clothing. His face was blurred, his posture rigid, as if he'd been waiting. That was enough for me. I packed everything I could fit into my suitcase within 10 minutes. I left the apartment, the building, and the entire city behind. I stayed with a coworker for 2 weeks until I found a new place. I broke my lease without explanation. I didn't care about the money. I never went back. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, on a warm March afternoon, a package arrived at my new place. Same brown cardboard, same block letters. Inside was a single torn photograph. The man in Victorian clothing standing closer now, his blurred face angled toward the camera as if aware of being watched. Behind him stood someone else, someone taller, someone darker. No note, no return address. Only a name written faintly on the flap of the box. E. Cross. And underneath it, next Christmas. I don't know who E. Cross is. I don't know why they chose me. And I don't know what will happen when December comes again. But I can feel it. Whatever followed me isn't finished. And when Christmas arrives this year, I know I won't be alone. I never thought a vacation could go so wrong. I'd planned this cruise for months, a week aboard the Neptune's Call, a luxury liner leaving from Miami bound for the Caribbean. I imagined sunlit decks, cocktails at sunset, and the gentle sway of the ship lulling me into perfect relaxation. I even splurged for a balcony cabin on the 14th deck. I had no reason to expect anything other than bliss. But by the third night, I realized that bliss could be a dangerous illusion. The first day was ordinary, even comforting. The ship gleamed in the Florida sun. I explored every deck, tried the poolside cocktails, and wandered through the lounges. Everything was orderly, polished, almost sterile in its perfection. Passengers smiled. The staff moved efficiently. Music played softly through hidden speakers. It was all so perfect that I barely noticed the small oddities, the way certain passengers moved slightly out of sync, or how some staff seemed to disappear mid-task, only to reappear elsewhere, always with that unnerving, fixed smile. I told myself I was imagining it. By the second night, I began to feel that subtle unease most people dismiss. I awoke in my cabin to the soft sound of scratching at the balcony door. Tap, tap, tap. I thought it might be wind or a stray bird, but then the scratching continued, irregular, deliberate. I approached cautiously. Nothing. The balcony was empty. I double-checked the lock. Secure. But the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling my skin in a way I couldn't shake. The third night, things escalated. I'd fallen asleep on the couch after reading on my balcony, only to wake to a faint glow coming from the corridor. I peeked around the door and saw the hall stretched unnaturally far, longer than it should have been. At the far end, a passenger I had seen at dinner stood perfectly still. I called their name. No response. They turned slowly toward me, Their eyes were hollow, void-like, and their mouth opened, not in speech, but in a slow, impossibly wide grin that stretched beyond any human limit. I stumbled back and shut the door, heart hammering. By the fourth night, I refused to sleep in my cabin. I spent hours on the upper deck, hoping the night air would keep me safe. But the ship itself began to feel wrong. I would glance at the water below and see shapes, dark forms moving just beneath the surface. They didn't swim like fish. They glided, silently, purposefully. One moment, they would vanish. The next, they seemed impossibly close to the hull, eyes flashing briefly, like they were watching. The fifth night brought something I couldn't rationalize. I awoke to laughter. A child's laughter, high-pitched, playful, echoing faintly through the corridors. I had never seen a child aboard. This cruise was adults only. I followed the sound, cautiously moving down a hall that seemed longer than memory allowed. At the far end, a small figure stood, a boy soaking wet, hair plastered to his face. He stared at me with eyes too dark, too deep, and smiled. Then he vanished. Not into shadows, not behind doors, just vanished. From that night on, sleep became impossible. Every corridor seemed different, stretching in impossible ways, doors opening to rooms I had never seen. On the sixth night, I attempted to flee, heading to the service elevators I had seen during a tour earlier. But when I arrived, they weren't there. In their place were darkened stairwells descending into unknown depths. The walls were slick with moisture, the air thick with the smell of rust and something else, something fouler, like decayed seaweed mixed with iron. I went down one of the stairwells, desperate to find the deck below. Water began pooling at my feet, rising quickly, cold, black, as if the ship itself were swallowing me. Faces appeared beneath the surface, pressing upward, mouths moving silently. I screamed, clawed at the water, trying to escape. When I finally staggered back onto a dry corridor, I realized the hallway had changed again. It was now filled with passengers, some from dinner, some I didn't recognize, all standing perfectly still, eyes vacant, mouths opening impossibly wide in silent screams. I fled onto the main deck, hoping for open space. The moonlight reflected off the ocean, calm and serene. But then I saw him, a tall man, soaked to the bone, pale skin, his mouth stretching beyond the limits of normal anatomy, his eyes dark and endless. He raised a hand slowly. The water along the hull began to churn as if alive. Shapes rose from beneath the surface, faces, hands, eyes, and they reached for me. I ran blindly across the deck. Every direction led to another impossible scenario. The ship itself was changing, twisting. Stairs led to nowhere. Hallways looped infinitely. Doors opened into rooms filled with water, each room containing more faces beneath the surface. I heard whispers calling my name, not softly this time, but urgent, insistent, echoing through my skull. I realized the ship was not just a ship. It was alive, hunting, waiting. I reached the edge of the deck and jumped into the lifeboat station. I pushed a boat into the water and began paddling frantically. The ship loomed behind me, impossibly tall, its decks twisted in impossible ways, passengers and crew on every railing, all staring at me. The water churned with shadows, hands reaching for me. I paddled until my arms burned, my chest heaving, muscles screaming. I didn't look back until I reached a small deserted island as dawn broke. Rescue came eventually, but the authorities found no record of the Neptune's call, no missing passengers, nothing. They dismissed my story as hallucination, sleep deprivation, or trauma-induced paranoia. But I know the truth. I have nightmares every night. I wake up hearing faint knocks on my apartment door, footsteps on my floor, whispers in the corners. Shadows move just beyond my vision. The Neptune's call is still out there, somewhere in the ocean, waiting. And I know it is waiting for me. I can sense it in every wave, in the smell of salt on the wind, in the quiet hum of distant ships. Cruise ships are no longer just ships. They are traps, predatory and patient. and anyone foolish enough to step aboard becomes prey. The last memory I have of that ship is the corridor that should not exist, water rising higher than it could, faces pressing upward, all whispering my name. I ran, I escaped, I survived, but the terror followed me to land, into every waking moment since. Sometimes when the wind carries the smell of salt and diesel, I swear I hear the ship calling, beckoning me back. And I know, without a doubt, that if I ever close my eyes too long, it will find me again. I will never cruise again. Not ever. But the truth is, it doesn't matter. The Neptune's call doesn't forget. It doesn't stop waiting. And one day it will come for me. It will... I never thought something as mundane as moving next door could turn into a nightmare. I grew up in the suburbs, and neighbors were supposed to be predictable. Some annoying, some friendly, but never truly terrifying. That all changed the summer I moved to Crestwood, a sleepy little town in upstate New York. I'd inherited my aunt's old house on the outskirts, and I thought it would be peaceful. It was quiet, far quieter than I expected, almost unnaturally so. The first week was easy enough. I unpacked, explored the yard, and tried to reconnect with the town. My immediate neighbor, a man named Frank, lived 2 houses down. He was older, maybe in his 60s, always tending to his lawn or checking the mailbox. Frank smiled when I waved and nodded a hello, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness, a wary tension that made me uneasy. I told myself I was imagining things. It all started with small, subtle oddities. At first, it was just noises, a thud in the attic, the sound of someone walking across the wooden floor when I was alone. I live alone, so I knew it wasn't anyone else in the house. I chalked it up to old floorboards settling, but a creeping sense of being watched never left me. Then, the mail started arriving odd. Letters with no return address, bills I didn't recognize, and photographs of my house, taken from angles I didn't think anyone could see. The photos were recent, the lawn freshly mowed, my car parked outside. I panicked, assuming it was Frank, though I had no proof. I wanted to confront him, but every time I tried, he would smile, wave, and retreat behind his hedge. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I was sitting on the porch when I noticed a shadow across the street. At first, I thought it was just a tree, but the movement was deliberate. Something, or someone, was pacing back and forth on his porch, staring at my house. I squinted, heart hammering. It was Frank, I realized, but not how I remembered him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, almost inhuman. His head tilted at angles that didn't make sense. I felt my stomach turn. I went inside and locked every door. That night, sleep became impossible. I could hear whispers outside, faint but insistent, repeating my name. The air felt thick, heavy, and cold, even with the windows closed. The whispers seemed to seep into the walls, wrapping around me. I lay awake, paralyzed by fear. The next morning, I discovered scratches along my front door, deep, deliberate, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside. I called the police, but they found nothing. No footprints, no evidence. Frank's lawn was immaculate. He smiled politely when they drove past, as if nothing had happened. By the 3rd week, I was unraveling. Every shadow seemed alive. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. Chairs shifted slightly. The television turned on by itself. The front gate I had locked swung open at night. I started seeing Frank in places he couldn't be. At the edge of the woods behind my house, through the living room window, standing perfectly still in the dark. His presence was always accompanied by that same unsettling feeling, like the air itself was thicker where he stood. One night, I woke to a low creaking from the attic. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight. I crept up the narrow stairs, each step groaning beneath my weight. The attic door was ajar. I pushed it open, shining the light inside. It was empty, at first. Then, in the corner, I saw him. Frank, or whatever it was that looked like him. His face was blank, pale, and eyes dark voids. He turned toward me slowly, and I could swear his head tilted in impossible angles. I screamed and ran down the stairs, tripping over the rug, heart pounding. From that night on, the activity escalated. I couldn't leave the house without seeing him, or something that looked like him, standing just beyond the trees, staring silently. I tried to leave, but every time I drove past the edge of the woods, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting in ways that defied sense. Sometimes I would see shadows moving alongside the car, pacing with me, keeping pace without making a sound. Desperate, I reached out to neighbors. Most avoided my questions, giving vague answers about the town, the old houses, and strange things that sometimes happen. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, finally spoke to me. Her voice was shaky. "He's always been here, always watching. Nobody knows where he came from, but he's been around longer than anyone. The townspeople pretend they don't see him, but he notices. He notices everything." I asked her what he wanted. She shook her head. "He doesn't want you to know. He just chooses." That night, I heard scratching at the windows. My flashlight barely illuminated the yard, but I could see him, or something that looked exactly like him, standing just beyond the glass, motionless. The whispers were louder now, circling the house, echoing inside my skull. I couldn't think, couldn't move. I just watched as the dark shape raised a hand and tapped the window lightly. I ran to my car and tried to leave again. The road seemed familiar, yet nothing was the same. The street signs twisted in the headlights, pointing in directions that shouldn't exist. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of the light, and then I saw them. Dozens of figures lining the streets, all standing perfectly still, all staring at me. Their faces were featureless, except for the older man, the original, Frank. I screamed, hitting the accelerator. The car roared forward, yet the shadows kept pace, moving alongside the car as if attached to it. I slammed on the brakes. They disappeared, just as suddenly as they had appeared. I sped through the night until the first signs of daylight. For weeks, I tried to convince myself it had been stress, imagination, paranoia. But things followed me home. Shadows in corners, whispers when I was alone, objects moving without explanation. It became clear. Whatever I had encountered in Crestwood, or Millbrook, or wherever it truly resided, had latched onto me. It was patient. It was intelligent. It didn't just watch. It followed. I've tried to move, tried to escape, but it always finds a way. A shadow in the corner of my eye, a tap at the window in the middle of the night, whispers repeating my name. And I know one day it will not stop. It will not rest. I write this as a warning. If you ever move near a town where the neighbors feel too watchful, if the air's heavier than it should be, if you start hearing whispers that shouldn't exist, run. Do not look back. Do not try to understand. Because if you notice it, it notices you. And once it notices, you are never truly safe. I know this because I live with it now, always watching, always waiting, and I fear the day it comes to collect me completely. I didn't intend to stay long in Cedar Hollow. Truthfully, I hadn't intended to stay at all. The town was one of those places that didn't show up on most maps, the kind of place you drove past thinking you might stop for gas or a cup of coffee, only to realize hours later that you'd gone through it without noticing. I was on my way to a research project in Vermont, driving through Maine, when my car broke down, forcing me to spend the night. It was late, nearly midnight, and I was tired, cranky, and desperate for a place to crash. The only motel was a small, faded building on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in erratic bursts. The clerk, a thin man with pale skin and dark, too sharp eyes, barely looked at me as he handed over the keys. "Room 7, he said, voice hollow. "Enjoy your stay." I should have left then. I should have kept driving, even if it meant walking to the next town in the middle of the night. But something, I don't know what, made me stay. The room was small, cramped, and smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarettes. I unpacked my bag, stretched, and tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I was exhausted, and I convinced myself that the feeling of being watched was just the anxiety of traveling alone. I slept fitfully, waking more than once to the creaking of the floorboards and the faint scratching sound coming from the walls. The next morning, I stepped outside. Cedar Hollow looked normal in the daylight. Quaint houses with peeling paint, a diner with faded red awnings, streets lined with tall oaks. A few locals moved slowly, glancing at me briefly before turning away. There was a silence to the town, a stillness that wasn't just quiet. It was deliberate, like the air itself was holding its breath. I wandered the streets trying to pass the time while waiting for a mechanic. I noticed the same odd things over and over. Doors left slightly ajar, windows that should have been locked standing open, and an unnatural absence of children. Where were the children? It was almost noon, and the streets should have been alive with laughter, yet there was only the occasional dog barking and the hum of an old truck engine. That night, when I returned to the motel, things started to go wrong. It began subtly. A knock at the door around 2 a.m., soft, deliberate. I checked and the hallway was empty. Then the whispers began. At first I thought they were coming from the air vents, faint murmurs, almost indistinguishable. But soon I realized they were calling my name. Ethan. Ethan. It was slow, deliberate, echoing in my head and in the empty room simultaneously. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and saw the shadows move. Not the normal, mundane kind that the flicker of a streetlight makes, but shadows that twisted and bent unnaturally, almost like they were alive. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I packed my things and tried to leave, but the streets of Cedar Hollow seemed unfamiliar in the dark. The layout had shifted. I recognized no road, no street sign, and the forest surrounding the town pressed closer than it had in daylight. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Tall, impossibly thin, entirely black, with a head that tilted in ways that defied anatomy. Its gaze, if you could call it that, felt like it pierced straight through me. I ran, the gravel crunching under my feet, until I made it back to the motel. The next day, I sought answers. I went back to the diner, hoping to talk to someone. Carol, the waitress, served me coffee with a polite smile, but her hands shook slightly. When I asked her about the town, about the missing people, about the figure in the woods, she leaned in and whispered, "You shouldn't have seen it. You shouldn't have been here. It notices, and once it notices, there's no leaving." I laughed nervously. Of course, this was a small town with superstitious people. They believed in ghosts and monsters. I told myself that, and for a moment, it comforted me. But that night, the whispers returned, louder, clearer. I could hear words I didn't understand, sentences formed in a language that seemed older than the town itself. I could feel the walls breathing, closing in, pressing against me from all sides. The motel room became a cage. Items moved on their own. My bag shifted, the phone slid across the nightstand, the blankets twisted around my body while I slept, or tried to sleep. I felt something brush my leg, soft, deliberate, leaving a chill in its wake. My dreams were worse. I dreamed of the figure in the forest standing over me, stretching impossibly, growing taller with each passing night, and always, always watching. I tried leaving again. I ran to the car and started the engine, determined to drive until I reached another town, another state, anywhere but here. But the roads of Cedar Hollow seemed endless. Curves appeared where they shouldn't, intersections led back to the same streets, and the forest loomed, dark and suffocating. I began to understand that the town itself was alive, a presence that watched and manipulated. It could twist reality, bend space, and it had claimed me. I began noticing subtle changes in the townspeople. Their eyes followed me too long, then darted away. Their smiles were too wide, too slow to fade. There were people who never blinked, never spoke, yet were always there, watching, measuring. I realized then that the town was patient. It didn't attack outright. It waited, learned, and it fed on fear. One night I ventured into the forest, desperate to confront the source of my terror. The trees seemed taller than they should, their shadows long and curling like fingers. The figure appeared almost immediately, stepping from behind an ancient oak, perfectly still, its faceless head tilting as it studied me. "You cannot leave," it said. The voice was in my head, but also in the space around me. My own thoughts felt like echoes. What are you?" I stammered. "You belong here," it said. The words sank into me like icy water. I stumbled backward, falling, and when I looked up, the forest had vanished. I was standing in the middle of the town, lights flickering, shadows pooling in corners, and the figure was everywhere at once, surrounding me, closing in. I ran, but there was nowhere to go. The streets twisted like a maze, the buildings stretched, the air thickened. I realized I had never been outside the influence of the town. Even leaving the motel, even trying to escape, had been a mistake. The town watched, and now it had me. Days, or was it weeks, passed. Time had no meaning. The whispers never ceased. The shadows moved freely, sometimes stretching into shapes I couldn't comprehend, faces forming and dissolving in an instant. I stopped eating properly, stopped trying to sleep, just existing, trying to keep some grip on reality. Then I found the journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the diner, of all places. It belonged to Victor Lane, the previous tenant of the motel. His handwriting was frantic, each word desperate. "The town notices, it waits, it feeds on those who try to leave. The people are hollow, vessels for it. It doesn't need flesh, it needs fear, despair. If you read this, do not try to escape. It follows. Once it sees you, it will never let go." That night, I understood the full horror of Cedar Hollow. It wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just sinister. It was a living, thinking presence. It had no need for bodies. It only needed me to be afraid, and I was. Every second, every breath, every heartbeat was mine to give it. I tried leaving again. I drove, endlessly, thinking I would reach another town, a highway, anything. But Cedar Hollow followed, roads warped, forests pressed in, shadows stretched across the road. I saw the figure in every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, puddles. I felt its gaze in my chest, in my stomach, in my mind. It was patient. I realized then that nothing, not distance, not speed, not reasoning, could save me. The town had marked me, and it would not release me. I moved far away eventually, renting an apartment in a city hundreds of miles from Maine. I thought I was safe. I was not. Shadows appear in the corners of my apartment, too fleeting to capture, too deliberate to ignore. Whispers rise in the silence, sometimes calling my name, sometimes forming strange, ancient sentences. Furniture moves, doors open, objects vanish and reappear. I see shapes just beyond the edge of my vision. I've come to accept a terrifying truth. Small towns like Cedar Hollow don't just hide secrets, they claim people. And if it has seen you, it waits. Patient, inevitable. I live now under that awareness. It will come for me again. It has already claimed me in every way that matters. One day I know I will return. One day I will belong to Cedar Hollow forever. No matter how far I run, I will never escape it. Thank you for staying until the end. Hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more horror.